Any questions on the reading or the slides that I didn't cover on camera yet? Because I do load you up with stuff to look at. So, okay, we'll go from there. Oh, well, that was cool. All right, what we call now in diversity training circles, to the degree that there's training, we call it intersectionality. And what intersectionality is recognizing that there are interrelated, interlocking systems of discrimination, which, building on the construct that Remy and I came up with, crash. So basically, for people who like the simplex, you can do the crash without the exponents, but given the theory of, hey, you got 10 fingers, just figure it out. Okay, this is actually happening and you should be able to perceive it because it relates to a lot of things that we're dealing with today. So in the matrix of domination, and the reason I'm basically orienting this as a counselor, not that you get necessarily degrees in this, because your formal training, especially if you're in psychology, doesn't even recognize that racism exists. Barely, for example, the counseling department of which I'm part of as a drug counselor, basically we had a whole in-service on Friday about poverty, which, interestingly enough, the people who write about poverty don't even come from a poverty background. So they study it. So none of them have ever come up from the inside, so they never really think about, okay, that college in particular has a middle class bias, and what happens to the middle class when the middle class is eroding due to forces that are not necessarily beyond your control, but are predictable, right? So if I talk with people and say, somebody actually had a criticism of me saying that, Mark Harris is a rich kid who's never been on the street, never been in a gang. How can he claim to talk people out of gangs? Well, you don't have to have gang experience to talk people out of gangs. You just have to make sense, and be able to, approach them without fear, because the reality is you're not a danger to them. And if you come to them with respect and say, look, you can try this, this, and this, and here is the pathway out, that is dangerous in itself. Because what happens if gang members who are super intelligent become integrated into mainstream society and start changing stuff? So think about it. If you're a Christian and that means emulating Jesus, who killed Jesus? Okay? If you're like Martin Luther King and you become dangerous precisely because people you're changing stuff nonviolently in a society that's based on violence, what does that mean? They're going to come after you if you're effective. So if you're going to do this kind of work, you have to kind of give up your attachment to being afraid of dying. Because if you're really good, they're going to off you. Hate to put it that way, but that's real, right? You're freeing people in a culture that was based on slavery. What do you think they're going to do when you upset the table of the money changers? Now, there's lots of different ways of responding to that, and I'm going to get off that particular soapbox by saying, okay, this analysis helps you look at not just what's happening to you, but can explain what's happening to other people in advance of what's going on through having gone through it. All right? So your task, for example, so in the matrix, we talked about interlocking systems interact with each other so that a poor, black, disabled, lesbian, agnostic could arguably be in the least powerful social position at effect of multiple forms of discrimination from all those different perceivable differences, unless she's the CEO. Now, you have to then consider what kind of organization would hire a black, disabled, agnostic woman in a wheelchair and make her CEO. What kind of organization would that be? Could happen in academia, could happen in corporate America, could happen in a lot of different places. But she would have to have come through a lot of barriers to be able to do that. So for example, if she would come into you for counseling, then you'd have to make her aware of all the things that are barriers and give her skills to overcome them from your position of power and privilege. And your position of power and privilege, which, okay, if I get called a rich kid, no, I'm not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but I might be rich to someone who's lower on the socioeconomic status than I am. Certainly understood, when I went to Africa, I'm going as an American with an American tour group, but I'm not necessarily being welcomed as a long-lost African brother. I'm being seen as an American, which means I'm rich compared to them, which is true. So it was kind of like a modification. It was a little shock, but the modification of the old thing from India, if a pickpocket meets a saint, the pickpocket sees only his pockets. Some Africans seeing an African American see only their wallets. Okay? But those of us who've gone to stay like Du Bois, who I'm going to talk about today, if we can get to it, I think we'll get to it, are part of what we've now called intersectionality in the 20th and 21st century. I'm just identifying that these folks have always existed. We just now had the language to talk about them. Okay, so it's not about oppression Olympics. Who is more oppressed than who? Freedom has to begin with freeing yourself and then being aware of who is an ally and when they are not allies, because your allies can betray you. In fact, as part of Justice Chess, we take that into account. The possibility that somebody could betray you, and why. It's not so much being a snitch, it's, okay, who's going to betray you for partner benefits? Okay? The matrix creates privilege systems which give advantages for discrimination in the larger interest of the matrix. An ally will assist you to the degree that they do not destroy their own privilege or where they have power. Just assume that they'll only help you if it doesn't hurt them. At the shallow end. The deep end, they will act to disrupt the system to your mutual benefit. So the strategy is building skill to empower yourself, detect systems of power that attempt to neutralize your influence, and continue on. Interesting lesson about power at the Super Bowl yesterday. So, in the isms, so the first two we talked about, which were basically overt, basically physical or verbal attacks, physical or verbal assaults that are openly have the intent. Then type 2 was microaggressions, which are also probably the most common. Type 3 is when people are part of an institution and the institution itself is not aware that people within it are doing type 1 and type 2. Okay? So the institution unaware means and remains unaware that people commit types 1 and 2 within the workplace as part of their business operation, therefore no policy is made against it. So obviously the institution is not aware of its own history or is basically created by people who have privilege. Okay, real simple, right? And privilege and no history. So, for example then, scientific research can be conducted as if racism isn't present, even as it's causing direct or indirect damage through neglect. Legal policy is set based on the research or case law, if there is any. And social conduct is allowed and all kinds of mayhem can occur without acknowledging damage. Now, this is basically the default for American institutions. Particularly American institutions that were openly racist, and I'll show you how that works. Right? So scientific research, legal policy, based on the research or case law. So for example, in the law, there's a reasonable, it used to be a reasonable man standard. Well, does the reasonable man know about what it is to be a woman in a society dominated by men? What's reasonable to a man might not be reasonable to a woman. What's reasonable to a white man might not be reasonable to a black woman or a black poor. You can see how far we could take this, right? What's reasonable to who? Reasonable means you think about it, or you have thought about it, or, like I was talking about last week. Right at the moment, the class is all men. We don't have to worry about getting sexually assaulted at night at Lane Community College walking across the parking lot. Maybe you worry about the cougar or the bear. Maybe. But otherwise, we don't, right? That's because we have male privilege. So type 4, conscious institutional where it's legal. So the institution deliberately discriminates because it's legal to do so. So example, European colonization, the state of Oregon, segregation of South, apartheid South Africa, Nazi Germany, Catholic Church in the Inquisition era. There are lots of examples. So essentially, when you have a type 4 institution that had that in its history and now it's type 3, does the discrimination go away? No, it's still there, but hidden. So type 5, conscious institutional and illegal. So it's illegal. It's illegal to discriminate. Laws are passed against it. It continues because it is profitable. And then if you're going to fight it, you have to fight it using the legal system, using the rules of evidence of a particular legal system. So as an example, I think I'll post this because I just got it. If you haven't read or heard of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, where she talks about under the present set of drug laws, and she doesn't put it this way, but I'm putting it this way because we're talking about this construct. A form of socio-structural violence by which, let's say 3% of the drug users do 97% of the time for drug offenses. Okay? So Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, basically says that there are more black men in incarceration for drug offenses, okay? And that's basically swelled the prison population. So the United States is now the land of the free, is the #1 incarcerator of its citizens in the world. More than Russia, more than China, okay? And a majority of those are black men for drug offenses, non-violent drug offenses. And she makes the statement that there are more black men in prison today than were enslaved in 1850. Okay? So, to call the prison industrial complex a new slavery is not far off, because they become permanently unable to enter the legal workforce, or their ability to enter the legal workforce is impaired, and they're under surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. So that's socio-structural violence, where the normal structures of society produce this. Now, I see your question. Where this becomes type 5, she sent an op-ed piece to the New York Times, so I don't know if you read the New York Times. I recommend it. She says, cops lie. Cops actually have an incentive to lie. Okay? Because their incentive is federal monies that are based on arrests. Whether you get convictions or not, doesn't matter. But they get federal money to, especially, to fight the war on drugs by arrests, which means in some jurisdictions like New York as well, they plant dope on you. And then you're arrested. And in the system. That would be a type 5. It's illegal to lie, right? We expect our law enforcement officers to not perjure themselves on the stand, to not break the law. Okay? And she's saying, well, look, it's not just me saying that. The cops themselves are saying this. Time after time. And she cites, these studies in her article as part of her book. Oh, so, who's going to believe who? If you're a juror, are you going to believe the witness, or actually the person in the orange jumpsuit, or the well-groomed cop? Yeah.
I was just going to bring up that I read in the New York Times that the fastest growth industry in the U.S. is our private prisons.
Yes. Right. Right. So actually finding a cop that, will admit to perjury is rare, right? So rules of evidence. All right, so usually I stick to CDOs, which is credit default swaps, adjustable rate mortgages, redlining, round filing minority job applications. So I'm talking about business rather than race and crime, because race and crime is a whole other thing, but it's an example. Using money and financial instruments that are targeted towards minorities, is a good example as well. Type 6, sociostructural violence. So violence, this is straight from Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was a revolutionary black psychiatrist who was raised on the island of Martinique. So violence is the use of power to diminish or harm the capacity of one group to flourish by another. Societies are built on structured patterns of behavior, which are replicated within institutions. So to have the greatest effect, it must be presented as normal, so that it would take concerted collective action of conscious individuals to change it. That is a civil rights movement, basically. Collective action. I mean, you can neutralize it for yourself with skill, but you need a movement behind you. That's precisely why any leader of that movement becomes a target. Okay, which is why, like Lil Monster talked about it in the rebellion to Ted Koppel, we're not telling you who our leaders are, but we read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post. But we learned the lesson with Malcolm and Martin. You kill leaders that are effective, precisely when they're effective. So we'll just appear to be gang members now. Right? So to have the greatest effect, it has to be normal. And Fanon gives a bunch of examples. Okay? So without that collective effort, it remains in place as normal. Now, disproportionality, as I was talking about the other day, is the easiest means of detection. So for example, there's another one. There's a poem I wrote where I talked about being bipolar. Not in the sense of DSM-4 or 5. I'm bipolar from Western civilization. I keep cycling between killing rage and post-genocidal depression. Self-defense Malcolm and nonviolent Martin. Those are the two poles. Geronimo the warrior and Grandpa David Mananya the prophecy keeper. Talking about my Indian side. The warrior and the peacekeeper. Amistad Singh Q and Nelson Mandela. Okay? Bipolar. Two poles, two different types of black people, two different kinds of Indian. How am I going to deal with this?
How many of us know who Singh Q is?
Yes. How many of you know who Singh Q is?
He's the SLA leader.
Well, not Amistad Cinque.
Oh, okay, that's another scene.
That's the historical Cinque that the SLA Cinque named himself after. Right? You should know both, too. John Brown and Frederick Douglass. Harriet Tubman and Nzinga. I can't say, this is still part of the poem. I can't say that 16 years in the military drove John Muhammad crazy. John Muhammad was the DC sniper. But it sure helped. And certainly the author who just got killed, the American sniper guy, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if maybe it's part of military culture, but if you're helping a vet with PTSD by taking him to the gun range and he shoots you,
That's really,
there's an irony in there. I'm still trying to figure out how going to a gun range is like therapy, but maybe it's a military thing. But it's okay. Okay? So maybe there's a red, white, and blue pill I can take. Make me feel proud and strong, patriotic like Colin and Condoleezza. So I can say the Pledge of Allegiance or sing the Star-Spangled Banner with a straight face. Alicia did good. I kept hearing crazily, Jimi Hendrix's Star-Spangled Banner like tagged onto the end. Maybe I should make a mixtape. Huh? Oh, Beyonce, yeah. Right. Well, I'm weaving Beyonce into the lesson. So, Du Bois' dual consciousness, cycling between Western civilization and something older. It's part of my bipolar. So, my degrees are in psychology. Bipolar also means cycling between these two people. The one on the left, Samuel Cartwright, was a Southern physician. Racist ideology as science. So when science itself becomes racist and that becomes normalized, you have a problem, particularly when that gets replicated a century or so later. Right? And Frantz Fanon, a revolutionary psychology as a solution. So the cure. Du Bois' dual consciousness. So keeping in mind Samuel Cartwright, Drapetomania aegypticus, and that is, he coined, within his science, Drapetomania aegypticus, I actually have that condition. He's basically saying, by coining that term, that slaves are crazy, mentally ill, for escaping slavery. That's what he called it. Right? Slaves are mentally ill for wanting to escape slavery. His view is that slavery improved blacks from a condition of savagery. Basic tenet of Western civilization, whites are superior to non-whites. That basically the sign of mental health is that you be a good slave. Now, you know what I feel about biblical-based Paul saying you need to be a good slave and conform to Massa. You already know what I feel about that. And what my people feel about that raised me. Here's a guy basically elevating that to science. And then, therefore, making it social policy. So I am a congenital drapetomaniac. That is, I am obsessed with freedom. I have freedom issues. I will fight and resist any attempt to enslave me as part of my mental health. Okay? That's what Fanon says. You need to resist this. Okay? His work and beliefs are foundational to American psychology. That is, the science within higher education that sets policy for not only the United States, but the world. This is part of the reason that the American Psychological Association does not recognize racism as having a social or moral or emotional impact to this day. They do not recognize it at all. Oh, you're making an excuse. You're sensitive. You people are too sensitive. Okay, so doesn't recognize that racism exists or that psychological damage occurs as a result of it. Okay, Franz Fanon, radical humanist. Racism scars and people accept abuse and internalize abuse, and the abusers are the exact institutions in society that are supposed to bring healing and education. That's pretty much what he's saying about when he coined the term sociostructural violence. It's not about being lynched. It's about accepting continual abuse from the very institution that is supposed to help you heal the abuse. And he observed this. He was from French Martinique, and when you're from the colonies, where do you go to school? Well, if you go to the French colonies, you ain't going to school in England. France, the Sorbonne. So, he goes to the Sorbonne, becomes trained, fully vetted medical doctor, gets posted to a French colony, Algeria, and then watches as if you're black and mentally ill, diagnosed, and white and mentally ill and diagnosed, the white people get talk therapy and drugs, and the black people get torture for the same condition in the same hospital. Torture is therapy as the norm. That's effed up. So he joins and assists the Algerian revolutionary movement and basically helps them get their freedom. And his books, particularly The Wretched of the Earth, Black Skin, White Masks, basically how people self-colonize themselves under colonialism, as well as Dr. Bulhan's book, Franz Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression, where he basically takes apart Franz Fanon's constructs and says, okay, this is what we should be looking at socio-structural violence. So the implications for us in schools, understanding some of the stuff they're going to be teaching you is whack, but you have to basically reproduce it on a test anyway to get your sheepskin and move on. Because if you try and become an activist, they might not hook you up. So this is from from two black psychiatrists, Historical Scientific Racism. In its long and ugly history in the United States, white racism has improvised 1,000 variations on two basic themes. 1, black people are born with inferior brains and a limited capacity for growth. 2, their personality tends to be abnormal, whether by nature or by nurture. These concepts of inferiority and pathology are interrelated and reinforce each other. Both have served to sanctify a hierarchical social order in which the Negro's place, quote unquote, is forever ordained by his genes and the accumulated disabilities of his past. Now, this is two black psychiatrists, or a black psychiatrist and a psychologist. Thomas and Sillon. They continue. The traditional corollary to this view is that black people function best when they stay, quote, in their place, unquote, i.e. inferior to whites. Social tasks and privileges normal to white men are too stressful for the black man. Blacks living in unnatural freedom in the North were prone to insanity. Mental health was associated with contentment and a subordinate place in society. Protest was a sign of derangement. So Samuel Cartwright, one of many promoters of this view. So drapetomania we talked about, and diaesthesia ethiopica, also rascality by overseers. Slaves destroyed property and avoided work and raised disturbances with the overseers. So if you remember Django, the parts that were historically accurate. Now, he got off light for running away, just having a brand of an R, rather than having his foot cut off. So when that whole dinner table discussion of phrenology, I mean, that was actually part of the racist science of the time. Basically saying blacks had smaller skulls and therefore they're inferior. You can tell by the bumps and all that kind of stuff. That was real. People believed that as part of the science. This is educated folks, so notice how they were educated and who educated them. All right, so in the historical view, blacks had smaller, less complex, less evolved brains. So one theory of racial superiority held that Caucasians, or Caucasoids, were the superior race that evolved after the biblical flood, Mount Ararat, and guess which Bible? Biblical flood. So Mount Ararat in the Caucasus Mountains, hence Caucasoid, literally of the Caucasus, that's what oid means. Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid. So for example, Sir Robert Downes of Down syndrome held that Mongolism, that is Mongoloid features in people with that form of mental retardation, were evidence of the inferiority of Asian people. Based on this construct, that's where being called a Mongoloid idiot came from. Now, understand, he's describing white people who were, because we hadn't invented the concept of fetal alcohol syndrome. Okay, so at that time, women were getting drunk and while being pregnant. Okay, we didn't even invent the concept of fetal alcohol syndrome until 1978. So in the 18th century, they thought alcohol was not harmful to the fetus. It wasn't harmful for you at all, so therefore you could drink. They called it literally in Latin the aqua vitae. That is the water of life, that it was no more harmful for you than water. That's why the Puritans were giving rum to 4-year-olds in the 1600s in America. Okay, because we hadn't invented a concept of addiction yet. So in this time that he's describing this, remember, we hadn't even, not that I told you guys this, but in my drug class, Western medicine is about 150 years old, and 150 years ago, they didn't even believe in a germ theory in this time. Okay? So they believe all kinds of whack stuff that we think are whack now, and I'm sure in 150 years, they'll think that what we're doing is crazy as well. Certainly they do in the Star Trek universe. All right, so today we call them developmentally disabled, and this particular fetal alcohol syndrome is the largest preventable cause of mental retardation that we have in America. It's caused by mom drinking. There are still some docs that say it's okay to drink a moderate amount. And I'm telling you, no alcohol during pregnancy is the safest course. There is no safe dose of alcohol during pregnancy. Okay, so even those views were basically widely held and formed official policy well into the 20th century, and some continue into the 21st. About racial inferiority and superiority. So, health practice, for example, then health disparities are one form of social structural violence because they're not accidental, but due to widespread social practices reinforcing unequal access or skill. So the reason I'm pointing this out to you is, okay, we're not necessarily going to get lynched, but we are going to get targeted for alcohol and tobacco. We are going to be exposed to cops that plant dope on you to bust you. Unless, of course, you have a number on the back of your uniform, in which case they'll let you go. But there's a reason for that, too. being set up like gladiators for the struggle, the entertainment industry. Benevolent deception. So, for example, in the early days, black people could not question white doctors, even when white doctors were deliberately doing things that were deadly or damaging in the interest of science. We won't really talk about the Tuskegee experiment until it begins later in the term. But this is an example of, for example, if you have any of your girlfriends or female relatives that go to a gynecologist, the speculum that they do vaginal exams with was invented using black slave women and using pewter spoons, sharpened pewter spoons, without anesthesia, because they didn't believe that black people having inferior brains could feel pain. So they would do these operations on black slave women to develop the speculum, and they had to be held down while they operated. That was normal then. Okay? That's what our medical system is based on. Right? So got discrimination built into it. So, you must know best because you're educated and you're a doctor. I'm here to say, as being a son of a doctor, I was taught by the doctors in my family, we need to educate ourselves to know as much as the doctor knows, at least about certain health conditions, and to be able to ask questions. So this isn't, understand, this ain't just black people. This is, how many of you feel comfortable questioning your doctor, if you have a doctor? 1 or 2, 3, 4, okay. Well, I suppose you best believe you should be able to do that. Bad things happen when you don't. So, for example, HeLa cells. There's a great book called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, where this black woman had cervical cancer. And basically, they scraped some of the cancer tumor from her cervix before packing her cervix with radium, which was the treatment at the time. So a radioisotope. Okay, so she immediately got cancer. I mean, she already had a cancer. They packed her. This was the standard treatment. Let's irradiate the tumor by packing your vagina with a radioactive substance. So of course she got cancer, and it killed her 3 months later. So they didn't question that because that was the same treatment that white women got too. That was the standard treatment in the 50s. Well, what her family didn't know, and where HeLa cells come from, if you study biology, is the first of the immortal cell lines. Basically, the tumors from her cervix were cultured in a laboratory and as was common in academia at the time, we just share it, right? So those cells have gone to the moon. Those cells have been in nuclear bomb blasts. Those cells have been done everything to them to see why they keep replicating and why they're so hard to kill. Meanwhile, the doctors that did that have made billions of dollars because there's been drug therapies made from those cells. Her family hasn't gotten a dime, nor do they even reap the benefits of any of the medicines that were developed from that. And there's a pattern of that, right? Tuskegee syphilis experiment is another one. Electrode implants, drug testing, Mississippi appendectomies, which is basically you go in, they say they're taking out your appendix, but they're actually removing your capacity to have babies. Naturally, this is all part of the African American experience. Not just us, but it did start with us. Okay, so black bodies are the scientific proving grounds for medical advances that benefit white longevity, but are not given to blacks to prolong their lives. So counseling that doesn't give relief in the form of allowing venting, building skill from microaggressions, or acknowledging that racism exists is part of sociostructural violence. which is why we had to come up with our own science. Science means you test it and you replicate it and it works for other people. So, from the book, Franz Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression by Hussein Abdullahi Bulhan. Dr. Bulhan basically wrote, well, this is just strictly from chapter 7, which I can upload to the website if you want. Just chapter 7 by itself is deep. I got the book. Chapter 7 is like, well, you're about to see it. So, not all of it. Human violence occurs at a personal, institutional, and structural level. Personal violence is the easiest to discern and control, and its effects are easiest to assess. Typically, personal violence is a phenomenon of a dyad, that is, two people. It often involves direct actions and means, like a fist or a bullet, and is restricted in place to place as well as time. Moreover, one can identify a specific perpetrator whose aims can be verified and a victim whose injuries can be assessed. There usually exists a perpetrator-victim relation preceding and subsequent to the violent incident, so both before and after. In some cases, violence indeed permeates the relationship as a whole. Nonetheless, personal violence permits the ordinary procedure of imputing intent, rendering judgment, and exacting retribution. So, as an example, so this is my commentary. So they note that social conditioning makes us think of violence as occurring between people, but not legally perpetrated by organizations and social structures. Okay, so if I were training you to become civil rights activists, not that I would even think of, why would you ever want to do that? And I have to point out that most civil rights struggle occurred outside the law. It was illegal. Even when there was laws supporting the rights. The struggle for civil rights, even if there was laws supporting the civil rights, it made it illegal to protest. This actually goes back in our English system of law that Americans inherited and built upon, going back to reading the Riot Act. You know what the Riot Act was? Okay.
King George.
Before King George. See? This is the Irish and the Scots, okay? The Highland clearances, which was basically racial ethnic cleansing from the English against the Irish and the Scots, because the Irish and the Scots were not considered equal to the English because they weren't Christian. They weren't considered white, even then. So here's what's happened. You heard the term blackmail? Okay? What blackmail was Britain means the land of cows. Okay? So your wealth was in your cattle. So the British would come into Ireland and Scotland, rustle the cattle. Okay? And because the Irish and Scots couldn't own the land, they had to pay rent. So they rustled the cattle, and then you had to buy back your stolen cattle with the rent money. The rent money was a form of silver called mail, black mail. Now, suppose you want to protest the rustling of your cattle. You could not, and some of you might have heard me joke about this, as like whenever three black people are together, oh, that's a riot. Halfway joking, only halfway joking. Okay, where that came from was in those times in England, if 3 or more Irish got together, that was considered a riot. So they read the Riot Act, and the Riot Act said, you would be subject to arrest if you gathered 3 or more, if you protested, if you spoke your language, if you were wearing your tartan colors, like your kilt. You could be read the Riot Act and imprisoned for 6 months or tortured to death. or sent to slavery in the West Indies or America. Which is how a large number of Irish and Scots got to America as slaves. Particularly the women, because they would kill the men and send the women and children off to slavery in Jamaica, America, British colonies. Hidden history, right? So, the Riot Act. 3 or more, you're a riot. You protest, we'll arrest you. Okay? English common law imported to America, right? So, legally perpetrated. So that's part of our American history, our American jurisprudence. So, slavery and apartheid/segregation or socially sanctioned violence against women, domestic violence, date rape, sexual assault are not considered violence that society will eradicate because society allows the conditions, that is the knowledge, ignorance, attitudes, beliefs, that perpetuate it and protected like lynching. So I'm saying domestic violence, date rape and stuff are protected just like lynching was. No, that sounds like a radical statement, but think about it. The numbers actually show that. For example, the Nicole number. Come on, ask the question. Okay. The quote-unquote trial of the century. What was it? OJ. What was the issue according to the press with the OJ trial? What do you remember from the OJ trial? The glove didn't fit, you must have quit, right? Yes? Was that the outrage?